You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, David.
Hello, Will.
And hello, listeners. Welcome to episode 213 of the Common Descent Podcast. This episode, we're talking about Decomposers.
So fun.
It's going to get gross.
It's going to get a little gross this episode. We will provide warnings when it is at its grossest.
Yes, we're going to try not to be as morbid as we possibly could throughout, but there are a couple of areas where that's kind of unavoidable.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about what happens after something dies.
Yes.
Which is, in itself, already pretty morbid, and then gets real gross real quick. Decomposers, decomposition, the process of breaking down a dead organism is the topic of this episode. We'll discuss what actually defines this concept and what other definitions overlap with it, the features and lifestyles of some of the organisms that do it, its importance, and then how it overlays with the fossil record, how it affects the fossil record, how we recognize it, etc., etc. This is a very cool, very multifaceted topic. There's a lot of different avenues that we could go down, so this will be a brief overview. But the reason we're discussing it is because it was requested, as all of our topics are. This one was requested by Noah, Allison, Joe, and Tony.
Thank you all for your contributions, as always.
Yes. And before we get into our first section of the news, some quick announcements. First and foremost, as always, we have a Patreon.
Sure do.
Our Patreon and our patrons fund this podcast top to bottom. It allows us to do all the amazing things that we get to do and continue our science education endeavors that we like to do. If you sign up on our Patreon, you can get extra goodies, extra content, extra episodes, extra live streams with us, and at certain levels, you can get your name shouted out here on the podcast. This episode, we'd like to welcome Field Marshal Windbag, Abby, and Greg the Vet.
Thank you for your support and welcome to the Patreon.
Yes, thank you, thank you. If you are interested in joining these illustrious patrons or supporting us, you can find links down in the description, so check those out. You can also find other links to get in contact with us, the Discord, and to engage with the community that are our lovely, lovely community. And speaking of both things you can find in our description and our lovely community, we got a bunch of mail recently.
We sure did.
Because we have a mailing address where you can send us stuff. You can find that on our website. We got a haul. We got some cool stuff. First up, we got a letter from Elizabeth telling us about their new museum job, which sounds very cool.
Very cool.
We got some Valentines and like Jurassic Park pencil in a letter from Mark. We got some t-shirts from Julie.
Yeah, Smilodon.
Smilodon, a little cute Smilodon.
Cute. Will was wearing it in the Patron live stream.
Yep. Julie's art, which is also extra awesome. And then finally, Jordan sent us 2 copies of Primitive Technology, the book from the YouTuber who makes the YouTube channel Primitive Technology. That is a survival guide / informative guide to a bunch of survival and natural craft skills.
Yeah, inspired by you mentioning this YouTube series in episode 18.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. And so thank you to all of you. These are amazing and awesome. On a similar note of engaging with our community, ETSU Common is coming up at the end of this month.
Yeah, right at the end of March. We are doing 2 things the last weekend of March. On March 29th, we are doing a museum meetup with fans at the Gray Fossil Site and Museum in Gray, Tennessee. We will be at the museum starting at 12 o'clock noon. Come by, check out the museum, hang out with us, and hopefully we'll get to introduce you to some of the people who work there, show you some of the cool stuff. And the next day, Sunday, March 30th, we will be presenting on 3 different panels at ETSUCon in Johnson City, Tennessee, where we will be doing speculative evolution, and we'll be talking about Jurassic World, and we'll be doing a paleontology Q&A with a bunch of our friends.
It should be a ton of fun.
It's going to be super cool. And then Very shortly after that, in April, we're going to be releasing this year's Silver Screen Science series.
Yes.
Where we will be discussing Planet of the Apes.
We have already started the marathon.
Yes, it's excellent. Speaking of new things that are coming out, as of now, you can listen to the pilot episode of Leave It to Us here on the main Common Descent podcast feed. It is the first episode we've released. The official season is going to start a couple months later, but for now, this first episode is out, plus the bonus episode of Chit Chat afterwards. Take a listen and let us know what you think. We will take your feedback into account as we prepare for the full first season of Leave It to Us.
And you can head to the Discord to discuss it, because there's a new section for it on our Discord.
Yeah, for talking about Leave It to Us and also plant stuff.
Exciting times. We've got a lot of cool stuff happening.
We sure do. Hey, before we get into news, real quick, one more thing, just a minor correction. Last episode was temnospondyls.
Yes.
And we talked a whole lot about the different groups of temnospondyls, and there was a group of temnospondyls called disaurophoids. Now, somewhere along the way in my notes, I accidentally wrote an extra syllable into that word. And then that just became the thing for the whole notes. So I called them disaurophoroids the whole time.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So they're called disaurophoids if you listen to that episode. And I mean, no, I doubt anyone was confused, because who knows that word. But that's not how you say that word. I mispronounced it for an hour and a half. So whoops.
Luckily, that's one of those words that if you just start trying to spell it, I'm sure it will get you to the right group.
Yes, Google should did you mean correctly on this one.
And with all of that, we can wrap up announcements and move into our first section of the episode, the news. Every episode, we like to gather up some recent research and studies in paleontology, evolutionary biology, and earth sciences, just to keep us all up to date and in the know. David, what's the news?
I'm not done yet talking about temnospondyls. So I've got news about temnospondyls on either side of the Permian mass extinction.
Ooh.
This is research by Amir Mahmood et al. In Royal Society Open Science, and we will link in the blog post to a press release on Sci News. Temnospondyls, an early, very successful group of amphibian-like creatures, possibly related to modern amphibians. Temnospondyls first showed up in the late Paleozoic and existed through to the early Mesozoic, which means they went right through the Permian mass extinction, episode 45, the biggest, baddest mass extinction in Earth history.
Yeah, quite the achievement.
This study looks to examine how they changed from before the extinction till after it. What were the sort of lasting impacts on this group? To do this, they examined around 100 species of temnospondyls, mainly focusing on stereospondyls, which is the group that was very successful after the Permian extinction. This was the Triassic group of temnospondyls.
Yes.
They compared the skull shape, interpreting feeding styles. They looked at body size. They also looked at their distribution, where in the world they were living, to see how all of these aspects of temnospondyl life might have changed. In the Permian, there were a variety of different body sizes and feeding styles. They went from tiny to quite large. There were a lot of broad-snouted temnospondyls that are considered generalized feeders.
Yeah.
Similar to an alligator. Similar snout, eating whatever you want. There were some long-snouted species that are interpreted as being mainly fish eaters, and there were short-snouted species that are often smaller that are considered insectivores, mainly eating little bugs. After the Permian mass extinction, this study found that temnospondyl morphological diversity was basically the same.
Huh.
They identified no significant loss or change in feeding styles or body sizes.
Okay.
There was no major emphasis on any, there wasn't a particular feeding style that seems to have become super common afterwards. They noted that in certain groups, body size declined for the 1 or 2 million years after the extinction, but only in certain groups, and then it quickly bounced back. There were extinctions among temnospondyls, but it seems their general diversity and variation didn't actually change from before and after the extinction. In fact, the researchers noted that in terms of their morphology, they actually became more diverse in the early Triassic and then dropped back down to, quote, normal levels in the middle Triassic.
Huh.
So in some respects, they did better after the extinction event. They also noted in terms of distribution that in the early Triassic, they are distributed widely from north to south and in between, which is interesting because there has been this hypothesis around in the past that around this time period, the tropics would have been so hot and so inhospitable that nothing could have lived there. This distribution also contradicts that.
Okay.
So temnospondyls seem to have done shockingly well in the aftermath of the Permian extinction.
Huh. Which is doubly surprising because, not only would you just expect to lose some diversity just because you're having extinctions.
Right. Just the roll of the dice.
Yeah.
Some things are going to survive better than others.
But also because, as we often say, mass extinctions are when the ecosystem collapses. You would expect that some lifestyles wouldn't be feasible after portions of the ecosystem collapse. That you were an insectivore, but then the bugs you were eating died, or et cetera, et cetera. But the fact that they maintained is very interesting.
Yes, the authors propose a couple of factors that might explain why they seem to have done so well. Again, there were plenty of extinctions among temnospondyls, but their general ecology does not seem to have changed. The authors point out that this is probably due in large part to their diets, that a lot of temnospondyls seem to have been very generalized in their diet. Mm-hmm. They weren't picky, which means that they were much more likely to still be able to access food after the extinction event. They also pointed out that freshwater ecosystems, which is where a lot of temnospondyls lived, in some ways are more stable. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. This comes up especially in the end Cretaceous mass extinction, because freshwater ecosystems aren't as directly dependent on plants and such. The actual food web is slightly different in freshwater ecosystems, where it's largely based on debris and bugs and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Also, temnospondyls, being very early branch of the tetrapod family tree, tended to have relatively low energy requirements. They were similar to crocs and reptiles and amphibians today, where they could probably go for a long time without food or without much food. They didn't have to be very active. Some combination of all of these factors seems to have allowed temnospondyls to basically just keep doing what they had been doing. And indeed, they point out that trend in the early Triassic seems to suggest that immediately after the extinction, they were able to do better because there was all of this open space in the ecosystems.
Yes.
But then by the middle Triassic, when reptiles and synapsids start to come back and take over more of the ecosystem, temnospondyls began to slowly decline.
Yes. That while their competitors were gone, they were able to have a boom time.
Yes. But once dinosaurs and mammals started showing up, it was not great times for temnospondyls anymore.
Which is so fascinating because very often that's the side of the temnospondyl story you hear, is how early tetrapods came out and they were pretty good, but then the much better reptiles and much better mammals came along and pushed them out of the way because they had fancy eggs and scales and they were the next step. And none of that's true, but very often that's the discussion you hear more often, is the replacement of the temnospondyls as the dominant tetrapods on land. But this really screams to the fact of they were extremely good at what they were doing. They kind of sort of shrugged off the Permian extinction.
Yeah.
What? So they were really, really exceptional at what they were doing. They just also had some really good competition come the Triassic.
Well, because once you start going through the Triassic, you get actual crocs. And synapse and other reptiles and synapsids doing all the things that temnospondyls are doing.
Directly competing.
Absolutely. You get a bunch of aquatic forms, and that temnospondyls shrugged off the Permian extinction, but could not survive the age of reptiles.
Yes, absolutely.
Very cool insights.
Awesome.
So take this little bit of news snippet and add it to the end of the last episode to fill out the story of temnospondyls.
We need someone, you know how they make those fan episodes of The Office? Where they take like deleted scenes and like and they edit together new super episodes? Someone start doing that with ours.
Yeah, make the full episodes.
Make the episode, all those episodes we've mentioned that we haven't done but are effectively spread out.
Yes.
Make those episodes. Well, my first news, since crocodiles got mentioned a number of times in that news, is about crocodiles.
Sure.
But modern ones.
Okay.
This is research on
Boring
how...
ones.
Yeah, no. Just present ones that are here for us. This is research on how warming temperatures seem to be affecting behavior in specifically saltwater crocodiles. This is research by Caitlin Brom et al. In Current Biology, and the article is by Richard Pilardi in Live Science. So, climate change, we've mentioned it a couple of times before here on the podcast.
Episode 113.
In general, things are getting warmer, which is having all sorts of effects that get discussed very, very often. This research was wanting to look into specifically effects that have been hypothesized and witnessed, but like the general concept that ectotherms, your cold-blooded animals, are going to be affected by these warming temperatures differently than mammals and birds who can maintain their temperature. Both are going to be affected, but the reptiles and amphibians are reliant on the environmental temperature to maintain their body temp. And they have to go through specific behaviors to change. If they want to cool off, they have to find a cool spot. They want to warm up, they have to find warmth, usually the sun. But with increasing temperatures, that's likely to affect these behaviors of maintaining temperature, likely to increase them having to find ways to cool off more often, because they can also overheat just like we can.
Yes.
It's not for the same exact reasons, like, we are trying to sweat and eventually our cooling system gets overtaxed, but their biology will also start to shut down.
Yes. At a certain temperature, your enzymes and proteins start to not work properly.
Chemistry goes, nope.
Yep.
This study was wanting to look at that through the lens of crocodiles, and specifically the saltwater crocodile or estuarian crocodile. This is the one known from Australia and up into the Philippines and so forth. Previous research had noted in crocodiles and captive crocodiles that at their upper body temperature limits, which is about 89.6 degrees Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius, they noted that seems to reduce their swimming and diving performance.
Okay.
That they swim less and they dive for shorter periods. And that, of course, when they get too hot, they spend more time with those cooling behaviors, basking on the shore with their mouth open, finding cooler spots, or seeking out like streams that are going to have cooler flowing water, stuff like that. This study is the culmination of a 15-year period monitoring crocodiles between 2008 and 2023. They studied 203 crocodiles at the Steve Irwin Wildlife Reserve in Queensland. They tracked their body temperatures with devices implanted under the skin, and with other trackers, they were able to monitor when they submerged and for how long. They took nearly 6.5 million temperature readings during that time, and they found some notable things that match what you would expect with the raising temperatures. Average body temperature of the crocodiles did increase over the 15 years. So, like, there was a overall increase in their average body temps, the highest being 0.99 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.55 degrees Celsius, average increase. They spent more days at their critical body temps, that 89.6 or 32 degrees. They were spending more days at the upper limits of what their bodies could maintain. 135 showed body temps that exceeded that at one point or another, and one individual showed body temps above those temperatures for over a month in 2021.
Wow. That was a hot crocodile.
These were hot crocodiles, and that what we expected, yes, the crocodiles are experiencing higher body temps and more extreme body temp periods and moments
Yes.
than they were previously.
Which is not remotely surprising because that same trend is what we've been seeing with the climate.
Exactly.
But it is very important to know and also sad.
Yes. Yep.
Those poor crocs.
Oh, yeah, just so hot.
Yep.
The highest body temperatures were linked with El Nino periods.
Okay.
El Nino being the seasonal Pacific currents that bring in warm currents and cause hot, dry spells on land. These are well known and are expected to become more frequent with climate change. And I think this research did seem to support that. Yeah, they do seem to be becoming more frequent. While monitoring the crocs and their diving, they were also able to get an idea of when they were doing cooling or warming behaviors. Basically, by if the data showed that the croc disappeared and then came back with a different body temp, they assumed it was doing something to change that body temp.
Right. You went off and found a stream or
Yes.
something and cooled down.
You did something, or you found a warm spot to warm up. You did something and it changed your body temperature, usually by a degree or two. And they did note that when the temperatures were hotter, those cooling behaviors became more common. And they spent more time doing them.
Makes sense.
They also noted that, like the previous research, they did seem to submerge for shorter periods.
Okay.
And this is very likely due to the fact that a warmer croc has higher metabolism, because that's how ectotherms work.
Yes.
Is we maintain our constant metabolism by keeping a constant body temperature. To be active and to digest, to activate their metabolism, reptiles, amphibians have to warm up. But if they are forced to warm, their metabolism will keep going up with it. And more metabolism means you burn oxygen faster.
Yep.
So they just can't hold their breaths as long. So they cannot dive as long because they're going to run through that oxygen in their lungs quicker than they on average would. And it will likely take them longer to recover at the surface. So it's just diving is not as efficient when they are overheated. All of this together just confirms that, yes, they are getting warmer. Yes, it does seem to be affecting their behavior. Whether or not this is being a direct detriment yet is not been confirmed by this study.
Sure.
It's logical that it could because, as they put it, the more time they're spending cooling off is less time they're spending hunting or looking for mates and stuff. They're busy doing one behavior that's going to take time away from other critical behaviors. But it's not been determined exactly what side effects other than changing their behavior
Right.
these changes have had yet.
I would imagine it also is going to change where they're spending their time, which might not have a direct impact on the crocs themselves, but could have an impact on the ecosystem.
Yes, absolutely.
If this is the one cool stream that's nearby, the animals that live in that stream might now be at more risk of being eaten by crocs because they need to stay cool, and it might throw the ecosystem balance off a little bit.
Yeah, you could see some major shifts as these top predators, the largest predators other than great whites in Australia, are moving around to new areas.
Yeah. These are, like I said, not surprising finds, but very interesting finds and very important, very, very informative.
Yes.
Because this is going to, in order to understand how ecosystems are going to change, we need to understand how each individual component of the ecosystem is changing. And I think studying saltwater crocs is a great place to start because they are one of the most influential species in wherever they are.
Yeah, absolutely.
If there is a saltwater croc around, it's important.
Yes, it is having an effect.
So how they're being affected is going to ripple out to their whole ecosystem.
Yeah.
And even possibly people.
Yes.
If it's changing where the crocs are spending most of their time, that could affect the likelihood of them interacting with people.
Well, it makes me wonder how soon it will be before we start noting them moving further south in Australia to follow the more ideal temperatures for them.
Yeah.
And yet that's going to be huge.
Yes.
Because that's now what wasn't croc territory will become croc territory.
Exactly. Well, my second news is also about archosaurs. This time, birds. Specifically, some trace fossils of bird feeding behaviors. This is very cool. This is research in the Journal of Paleontology by John Paul Zonneveld, Sarah Naoni, and Brooks Britt, and we will link in the blog post to a press release on phys.org by Sandy Oster. These fossils come from the Green River Formation in Utah, which is a very famous formation here in the United States that dates to the Eocene around 50 million years ago. Green River is famous for like super well preserved fish and footprints and all sorts of like really high level preservation. This particular study is examining a rock surface within the Green River Formation that is covered with a bunch of footprints. These footprints are birds. They are very classic bird footprints. They are also webbed.
Hey!
So these are water bird footprints. The footprints themselves, as we've discussed many times, trace fossils get their own names. Episode 118. These footprints are known as Presbyornithoformipes.
Woo!
They are presumed to be made by a bird named Presbyornis.
Okay.
This is a type of bird that is known from fossils in the Green River Formation. Based on their skeletal remains, they appear to be duck-like. They also seem to be somewhat related to ducks. They're not within the duck family, but they're somewhere in the not-too-distant parts of the tree. And they seem to have been hanging out around lakes and bodies of water and stuff, based on where the fossils are found. So these were duck-like birds, and those webbed footprints are presumed to be these birds walking around on the ground.
Makes sense.
These particular tracks were made in mud flats, so lakeside deposits. The trackways are cool, like fossil webbed bird footprints is very cool.
Yes.
But on this particular surface, along with these trackways are all of these other traces that are found next to the bird tracks, between the bird tracks, or in some cases overlapping with the bird tracks.
Yeah.
Always in association with the bird footprints, and they appear to be traces made by the beak.
Yeah.
As the bird is foraging. Originally, when these were first discovered, they discussed this in the press release, that these originally were called dabble marks.
Yeah, yep.
Although the authors do note that dabbling refers to a very specific behavior that is not actually what we're seeing in these foraging tracks.
Yeah, if I remember right, dabbling's like the surface of the water.
Yes.
That they do at the surface.
Also, dabbling, it sounds like, refers, depending on where you are and who you're talking to, dabbling can mean different things.
Yeah.
So they mentioned that it was like colloquially they called these dabbling tracks,
Okay.
but in the paper they don't call them that because they're like, but technically that's misleading.
Yes.
They describe 4 new ichnospecies, 4 different types of trace fossils in this paper. Here's what they are. The first is Erevnoichnos blocki, which are a series of what they described as olive-shaped pits in the sediment, joined by grooves between the pits, which are interpreted as being formed as the birds stick their beaks in the sediment and sweep them side to side while opening and closing the beak to make little troughs in the sediment. The pits are when the beak is open, and the grooves in between them are when the beak is closed, moving to the next place to open a pit.
Yeah.
This is a behavior we see in modern water foraging birds, as all of these are. The second one is Erevnoichnos strymena, which are closely spaced, gently arcing grooves, which are interpreted to be made by the beak probing forward into the sediment. Rhabdosichnos gunteri are simple long grooves with a U-shaped cross-section, which appear to be made when the birds drag their beaks backwards through the sediment. And Aptosichnos diatarachi are broad, shallow grooves with complex fill patterns that are interpreted as the evidence of bill stirring.
Yeah.
Where they'll stick their bills in there and then scrape and plow the sediment with short movements. All of these are behaviors we see in modern water birds as they search through like lake mud and stuff, looking for food. This is very cool because, number one, foraging traces like this are very rarely, at least rarely recognized in the fossil record. Number two, this is a very rare case where multiple different types of traces can be associated with a very likely track maker. We probably know what species was making these tracks, which is very cool. And with that in mind, it's exciting because Presbyornis' feeding style has been the subject of some debate in the past. Some early studies of the jaws suggested that it might be a filter feeder, similar to like flamingos today.
Yeah.
But then more recent studies have questioned that hypothesis. Here, if these are indeed Presbyornis footprints and traces, this is direct evidence of foraging behavior, tactile foraging, as they described it, as opposed to filter feeding.
So cool.
Which is an extremely cool thing to find.
This is like an incredible fossil find. Just, you have footprints, feeding traces, and multiple kinds of feeding traces, all which are from a site where we also know another fossil organism that likely fits all of that.
Yes.
That's awesome. You don't get that very often. And super neat to like be able to piece together. As I always say, I love trace fossils like this because you get a glimpse into the life. And not only do we get a pretty darn detailed glimpse into the life of this organism, but it's so cute.
Yeah.
It's just a duck being a duck
just
through the mud.
Sticking its beak around in the mud, looking for little bugs and stuff.
Making silly waterfowl noises, probably.
Yeah, probably. With his little webbed feet kicking in the water.
Platting around.
Yeah, in the paper they compare some of these behaviors specifically to like herons, where they'll say this behavior is well known from herons or from storks or whatever. So these are very much like modern water birds.
Yeah. So neat. That one just makes me happy.
Yeah, it's a very cute one. It's a real uplifter after your news.
Oh yeah. Nope. My next one is also pretty cute and has to do with feeding techniques.
All right, hey, great. We're on the same page.
This is about how we figured out at least some of the things narwhals use their tusk for.
Oh, I see. So when I put the news list together, sometimes I'll see a news and go, Will's going to choose this one.
Yep.
I put the Crocs one right up at the top.
Yep.
I was like, well, this to save Will some time searching for news.
I appreciate it.
And this was the other one. I was like, yeah, probably Will's going to... Although there was a lot of cool news this time.
There's good news this time.
Tell me about narwhals.
This is research by Greg Okori-Crow et al. In Frontiers in Marine Science. And the article is by the Florida Atlantic University in SciTech Daily. So narwhals, you've heard of them. We've talked about them. They are real. These are the Arctic whales that have, the males mostly, the famous spiral tusk coming out of the front of their snout.
Yes, episode 107. Also episode 172.
Yes. An elongated and spiraled canine tooth. Both males and females have these tusks, but the males are typically the only ones that have it erupt. And it always is much longer in the male than the females, reaching up to like 10 feet long. So like 3-meter long tusk coming out of the face of this whale. And it's always been a bit of a debate what it was for. There's been lots of ideas, whether it was sensory, whether it was used to like break holes in the ice to help them breathe.
Yep.
Some behaviors are known. Tusking is one behavior they have where the males kind of cross them like swords sticking out of the water. And it's definitely some sort of dominance display or way for them to show off to potential mates against each other. Right.
Kind of like animals with horns pushing against each other.
Yeah. So like it's not I don't know if it's clear whether or not they are fighting each other, but that this might be a ritualistic way to display, look how impressive I am compared to this loser. And that's one thing we've known, but it's surely not the only reason.
Sure.
And if there are other uses, we've been kind of unaware, and narwhals are kind of difficult to study because they live in a tough part of the world to get to, and behaviors with the tusk just haven't been captured. This study is reporting on the findings that they got using a aerial drone, a UAV, in Canada's high Arctic, where they filmed narwhals and got to record 17 distinct behaviors of them using the tusk and interacting with other animals.
Cool.
And saw them using the tusk as a way to seemingly catch fish.
Huh.
Yeah.
Are they like smacking fish with it to stun them? That's a hypothesis I've heard.
Exactly. Using it to not only like hit and stun the fish, it seemed, but also maneuver and manipulate the fish. like reposition them and redirect them while the fish is even like still alive.
Huh. So like
nudging the fish.
Right, or like herding them in the direction you want them so that you can then grab it.
Yes. And this is an exciting study to get to talk in the news because I saw video of this, like this videos that they're talking about in a documentary. I can't remember which one it was.
Oh, cool.
Of them showing them doing it. But this is finally the publication on that video used in that documentary, which is really great.
That's great.
The fish they were chasing were Arctic char, which kind of look like salmon, to give you a picture. And they would watch them hit and manipulate the fish with the tusk and the tip of the tusk particularly. And noted that sometimes they did seem to hit and stun them. And they put in the paper as possibly as a hunting technique. Mm-hmm. You know, this is still like...
It could just be a mistake.
Yeah.
You're just really big.
Yeah, right. Oops. Sorry, little buddy.
Sorry about that. Let me give you mouth to mouth.
Because this is the first time we're reporting on it. So they're very cautious in how absolute they are in describing any behavior. They noted different behaviors in the tusk usage that they recorded. Some actions definitely seem like they are in line with prey capture, so definitely seem like hunting. There does seem like there might have been some that were just exploratory.
Sure, just feeling around.
Just messing with the fish, exploring the fish, investigating it. Potentially even play-like behavior, which is interesting, one, because... a unique way for the tusk to be used, and the first documentation of play behavior in narwhals.
Yeah, it's not surprising in toothed whales.
Yes, absolutely.
Dolphins and orcas and stuff.
It would be kind of weird if you weren't playful.
Well, also, if I had a 10-foot-long tusk sticking out of my face, I would also play around with it.
But, like, we'd never actually witnessed play behavior in these whales specifically. There was also some behavior that might imply teaching and learning behavior between some of the narwhals.
Like how to write their ABCs.
Right, exactly. To practice to be conductors.
Carving.
They noted that some of the behavior was competitive, with whales seeming to try to outposition and maneuver other whales while going for fish, while others seem to be potentially communicative, like cooperative to some degree. So, like, there does seem to be different behaviors going on with it. They said it never seemed to be openly aggressive, but that there was differing degrees of friendliness when it was being used.
Sure, like nudging versus shoving, something like that.
Or like we're both trying to go for the same fish. In some cases, in spite of each other, and in other cases, maybe helping each other. And sometimes it seemed like maybe there was a teaching or learning moments going on.
Yeah.
They noted that the use of the tusk was remarkable, extreme dexterity in how they were nudging and manipulating the fish, often with the very tip of the tusk.
Huh.
And so very precise movements and usage of the tusk in this way. And as I said, often when the fish was still alive, so like tapping it to get a response from the fish. So a lot of it was not just immediately stunning the fish, but they were doing something with the fish while still alive.
That's so cool. That's really, on the one hand, not remotely surprising.
Yeah,
because
makes sense.
This all makes a whole lot of sense for what you would do. But also, I'd never really thought of them using it as like a tool.
Yes.
Because the way that this is being described is very similar to the way that like certain birds or primates will use sticks.
Yes.
Like you'll pick up a stick to maneuver something or access something that you can't otherwise access. This is an animal that has a giant stick built into its face that it can use for those purposes. But also the idea that it might be a communicative thing, that it might be like reaching out and tapping your neighbor to get their attention. Every time that this subject has come up in the past, I have heard it as are they doing this? Are they doing this? Are they doing this? These disparate possible functions. This study really drives home that like, yeah, they're probably doing whatever they can think of.
Yeah.
With those tusks. They're probably just interacting with their environment in just a whole bunch of different ways.
Well, I mean, and like this is likely will seem like a weird comparison, but in many ways, it's similar to an elephant's trunk of you have this really large, prominent, notable appendage off the front of your face. It makes sense that it would be multi-purpose.
Yeah. Yeah, they're probably doing anything we might be tempted to do with a structure like that.
Yep.
Testing out the environment, moving stuff around. It does really drive home how good their vision must have to be.
Yeah.
To precisely maneuver the tip of this tusk that's 10 feet away from your eyes.
Yeah. Well, it makes me wonder, what sensations are you getting?
Yeah, can you feel, do you get a tactile response?
It's also notable that this is also only stuff that's mostly going to be males.
That's true.
Females don't typically have long tusks, and many of them don't have tusks.
The females are just constantly annoyed
yes.
about being tapped and poked with this tusk. They're like, stop it!
There's no way I could be touching you from way over here.
Don't make me come over there.
One of the other fun things they also recorded in this is kleptoparasitic behavior from gulls trying to take some of the fish being caught by the narwhals, which is, once again, not surprising.
That's what gulls do.
That's what gulls do.
Stealing food from others is kind of their thing.
But also the first time this kind of interaction has ever been noted with narwhals, bird, and fish.
Yeah, well, the idea of a narwhal reaching out, smacking a fish and stunning it, and then in the few seconds it takes for it to swim closer, a bird swoops in and grabs the fish.
Sometimes I'll really regret this 10 feet.
Yeah, it does. It really should have. And the females are like, Dad, serves you right for poking all the rest of us.
Well, you hungry? It's got the fiddler crab thing of only getting to eat one claw at a time, while the females are just like, I'm full already. 2 claws are great.
That's super cool. What a fun... Well, and now it's that also recontextualizes fossil structures.
Yes, exactly. I have the same thought.
When we find a structure like that, it's like, oh yeah, they might just be pushing fish around with that. That's so cool. Well, speaking of cute things, I have one more very quick news note.
Not bonus news?
Just a little bonus one. Flying squirrels at the Gray Fossil Site. This is research. Now, this is not news to me or to you because we've known about this has been known, but it's published.
Yay!
This is research by Montserrat Grau-Kametz, Isaac Casanovas Villar, Cheyenne Crow, and Josh Samuels in the Journal of Mammalian Evolution, and we'll put a link in the blog post to an article on Live Science by Patrick Pester. Tennessee today has flying squirrels. Yes. There are gliding squirrels here in Tennessee today. They are pretty normal rodent-sized. This study identifies one tooth as being a molar or probably a molar, from the fossil giant flying squirrel Myopetaurista. This same species is known from Florida in the fossil record, but this is older than that, so this is the oldest example. Giant flying squirrels still exist today in Eurasia, but they are no longer in North America. We only have the regular flying squirrels.
Small size.
The article notes that Myopetaurista's estimated size, I assume this is by comparison to modern giant flying squirrels, is that... So, Tennessee flying squirrels today come in at 2.5 ounces or 70 grams, whereas Myopetaurista is estimated to have been more 3 pounds or 1.5 kilograms.
Woo!
So giant.
That would hurt when it falls on you.
Yeah, that just a bam, right in the head. And this extends into hypotheses by the authors about how this group of flying squirrels moved around the planet at the time. That they were probably traveling across the Bering Land Bridge during particularly warm periods that allowed them to spread to different places.
Yay.
This is cool. It's just an extra little note. Very fun. Maybe this will spur the folks at the museum now to hang a flying squirrel skeleton from the ceiling.
Yes.
Which we've talked about in years past, but hasn't happened. This could be it.
What we need to do is get one of those hanging, me and Anna found it recently. It was a air freshener that you put together, and it's a bat hanging.
Oh, yeah.
But we need to do one for giant flying squirrels.
You don't even need a whole fossil skeleton. We have them today.
Yep.
Just go get one of the modern ones and get the skeleton and hang it from the ceiling.
Yes. Cool.
Good stuff.
Well, speaking of the remains of modern organisms...
The easiest segue in the history of the podcast.
Speaking of things that have died, what happens after that? Let's find out after this musical break. So to start out, as we so often do with topics like this, some definitions.
Dictionary time.
Let's do some definitions. Defining the terms decomposition. Decomposition, which is also kind of synonymous with rot.
Yeah.
Those are basically synonyms. Sometimes rot specifically refers to certain parts, but these terms go together.
Yeah. Rot is also a term that is sometimes used for certain species of fungi.
Yeah, exactly.
So it could be like, this is wood rot, which is a type of fungus, but for something to rot and to rot away, it basically is the same thing as like decompose?
That wood rot is decomposing that log.
Yes.
Decomposing is the breakdown of organic materials. Plant material, animal material, any organism that dies, the degradation of that corpse is decomposition. To put it most simply, it's the breaking down of those complex parts into the simple building block parts. The organic or inorganic materials that make up an organism. All
those things that Edward Elric kept reciting.
Absolutely, yep. That's what you would get once we're decomposed. Part of this process is often referred to as remineralization, where the body part is broken down into parts, which many of which are minerals, salts and iron and things like that. It is remineralizing. And so decomposition, part of it is the remineralization and making those things available again.
Yeah, it's the opposite of the processes that life uses to keep the body running.
Exactly.
Taking things in from outside and using them to build up the pieces of the cells and tissues.
The study of this is taphonomy. What happens to a thing after it dies is taphonomy. This is not going to be a taphonomy episode. We will have a taphonomy episode, but that will come up from time to time, so this will overlap, I'm sure. There are different components that can cause decomposition, both biotic, which is a lot of what we're going to be talking about, is the organisms that cause decomposition, but there can also be abiotic, just natural processes, UV light, rain and wind, hydrolysis, and the natural environment just damaging the physical aspects of the body.
Also entropy.
Yes, exactly.
Just a lot of the molecules in our body aren't stable outside of being held together by life processes. So once it's not active anymore, stuff just starts falling apart.
Exactly. So decomposition is the breakdown. It doesn't have to be the active breakdown. It can be the passive breakdown just by the environment doing damage to this now no longer living animal or plant. Very often, it is kind of broken into two general phases, destruction and degradation. Destruction is the physical breaking up of the corpse, and degradation is the chemical breaking up of those parts. This makes it fairly similar to digestion.
Oh, yeah.
Chewing is the physical breakup of food, and then digestion is us chemically breaking it down in our system. So there are times where digestion and decomposition are kind of hard to separate.
Yeah, well, digestion is doing the same thing of breaking down organic material into the component parts.
So yeah, typically when we say digestion, we're usually speaking of internal digestion.
Yes.
Which does separate it from most examples of decomposition, that this is something taking in matter and doing those processes inside their body. But there are external digesters, fungi and stuff, digest by putting their enzymes and chemicals out onto whatever they're going to eat and then absorbing the broken down materials.
Episode 200. And also we have a bunch of microbes inside our digestive system who are kind of decomposing things to assist with our digestion.
Absolutely.
So that's interesting. I've never really thought about the overlap there before.
Like plant eaters fermenting the plants in their stomach.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of overlap between a lot of different things with decomposition. Very often have been definitions that just kind of conflate external digestion and decomposition. because most fungi are external digesters, and fungi, as we will get to many times this episode, are the go-to example of decomposers.
Mm-hmm.
But not all external digesters are decomposers. There are animals
and not all decomposers are external digesters.
Exactly. So there's a lot of overlap. There's times where they are the same, times where they aren't. To move on to our next term that we've already used a couple of times, decomposers are the agents of decomposing, the organisms going about and causing the process of decomposition. Bacteria, fungi, lots of animals. These are also often called saprotrophic, saprotrophs. You'll even hear more specific things like fungi. Microscopic ones are called saprobes, and bacteria that do it are saprophytes. But saprotrophic is a term you'll see come up. We're going to use decomposer because I like it better.
That's the name of the episode.
That's the name of the episode. This definition is also kind of wobbly. Typically, most times that you'll see the definition used, this definition is describing a role in the ecosystem, not a kind of organism, kind of behavior, or kind of like the way they decompose or feed. It is what they're doing in their ecosystem. There are many ways to decompose, and for an organism to be a decomposer. But if they are breaking down dead material and making those materials available to the ecosystem, they could be considered and described as a decomposer. But some definitions do separate this breakdown in that decomposers are ones who are breaking it down externally or outside of their bodies in some way, and detritivores are the ones taking in material, and they're still breaking it down, but the resources are coming out through their feces.
Right. Yeah, detritivore, eating detritus
Yes.
is a term that is kind of synonymous a little bit with scavenging.
Yeah.
That you're eating just organic remains that are out in the environment. That can be body parts. It can be poop and stuff like that. Unliving organic bits and pieces. A lot of detritivores are like insects on the forest floor or things that crawl around on the ocean floor, because the floor is where detritus ends up.
Exactly.
That's an important part of the decomposition, the quote cleanup process.
And this is one of those where whether you choose to separate decomposers and detritivores, or to just call them that detritivores are a version of decomposer, is really kind of personal preference, because there is not actually a technical distinction that is consistent between those two. Same goes for scavengers. Scavengers usually don't get called detritivores, mostly just because the one description I found was they eat big bites.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, you're eating the whole corpse.
You're eating big chunks, and that's not what make the
That's not detritus.
They are tiny.
That's an elephant.
Yeah.
That's just a whole body.
So, like, scavengers are also a key part of breaking down a dead organism, but they usually are kind of seen as the first separate stage that a scavenger comes onto the scene, does the heavy lifting in dismembering or taking a lot of material away, and then detritivores and decomposers come along and finish the job.
Yes, we talked in episode 128, we talked a bit about whale falls and the stages of whale falls, which follow what you just explained.
Exactly.
Big scavengers show up, then like crustaceans and stuff come and clean up all the little bits. Then you get things like your bone worms that are breaking apart the bone, chemically dissolving those bones.
Exactly, and we will talk about whale falls more later in this episode.
I was wondering.
Absolutely. But all of this to make the point that, much like when we talked about the parasites episode, the line between these groups is arbitrary.
Yeah. This comes up every time we talk about diet.
Yeah.
On the pod. This came up in herbivores, 173. This came up in sanguivores, 134. These are boxes that nature does not like to conform to.
So we're going to use decomposer as our term, and a lot of the organisms we're going to talk about could be argued to be more accurately described as detritivores. They're going to be treated as decomposers for the discussion because they are doing the same portion of the job, and they are often inalienable from the process of decomposition. You cannot separate out maggots from decomposition, even though they are physically eating the body, but you can't take away the, dung beetles. They are part of the process inherently.
Yes. So in this episode, decomposers in the broad sense.
Yes. So next, let's talk a bit about why decomposers are so important, because they are so important.
Yeah.
Arguably one of the most important biological roles in any ecosystem.
Yeah. When we learn about food webs, we learn producers, consumers, and decomposers.
It's one of the three. And the reason decomposers are so critical, like we've talked about that plants and autotrophs, producers, are critical because they allow us to use sunlight to then make it into usable energy. But there is a finite amount of resources on this planet. There's just a finite amount of matter. We only have one Earth's worth of stuff on the Earth. And if we only grow stuff from it, we will run out of material to use. Decomposers are the ones that complete the circle back and allow producers, plants and algae and things like that, to grow new stuff.
When we die, our bodies become the grass.
Exactly. Decomposers are critical for nutrient cycles, the carbon cycle, and the remineralization of organisms, making the building blocks of life available again to be built into new life. If there weren't decomposers, you would have organisms grow, die, and then all of that good stuff would be locked away in corpses that never broke down. And eventually you would run out of stuff to build with, and the Earth would be dead. So decomposers are kind of important. I found one statistic that I feel like just perfectly puts it into perspective. 90% of the CO2 released yearly is due to decomposition.
Yeah.
Like, they are 90% of the carbon cycle. So, kinda critical. Carbon, being carbon-based life forms, kind of important.
Kind of important. We need that around.
This is also critical for the fact that plants are main sources of producers and oxygen producers, cannot go seek out their own nutrients.
Yeah.
So without decomposers in their environment, they would exhaust the nutrient in the soil very quickly and then not be able to grow. Healthy communities of decomposers in the soil and in the environment are what allow plants to use the dead body that becomes the grass. That's the step that these are the intermediates that allow that to happen. They're also critical for keeping bodies from building up. Like, not only making it available, but without them, there would be just an accumulation of death.
Yes. They are the cleanup crew.
Yep.
Not only to clean up, like, space, but also corpses are where disease is likely to spread, so they maintain a healthy environment.
And we can see examples when they aren't there in, like, salt flats.
Yeah, I've talked on the podcast before about my trip to the Great Salt Lake, where there were just dead birds laying on the salt flat, intact because nothing was living out there that could quickly break them down.
Yeah. If you were to go to the moon and die on the moon, you're just going to stay on the moon until very slowly cosmic rays and the sediment of the moon wear you down like a rock.
Yes, until you erode.
So without decomposers, it takes infinitely more longer for things to break down. This is especially important for things that are difficult to break down, like wood, which is famously strong due to its lignin and the cellulose in plant cells. They're very tough materials.
Yes, it's an incredible evolutionary innovation to create this extremely sturdy material.
Yes.
That is then problematic. Well, like, it's like plastic.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, we made plastic and it's great until we throw it away and then it just sticks around for a while.
It's basically indestructible.
Which is why you need to be thankful for fungi.
Yes.
Not for the plastic. They haven't figured that out yet. But the wood.
I do think there was a fungi found in the ocean that, like, has started to react to plastic.
That sounds like a fungi thing
right?
to do.
Though, as we're talking about their effects on the environment, they also have side effects. Like, when a body is being decomposed, the stuff that's broken down creates an effect on the environment around it. Like, you'll get dead plants around it as the soil is inundated with all this new material until then eventually the plants are able to grow from it. But, like, they do create what I've seen a couple of times called decomposer spheres.
Oh, interesting.
Of an area of effect that changes the nature of the ecosystem for a bit. Yeah. And then you have to wait a while before you see it bounce back to before that body fell there.
Yeah, which is much less noticeable when something like a bug dies versus like an elephant.
Yes, exactly.
When an elephant dies, you get like a dead zone.
Exactly. And like that will be there for probably years. It's like if you spill gasoline on a part of the lawn. That's going to be a dead spot in your lawn for forever until eventually that gasoline fully off-gasses and fully is washed away. But it's going to take years. And this is kind of the opposite note of environments affecting decomposers, but I found it interesting of one making a note that raising temperatures are likely to increase decomposition rate in Arctic areas as soils become more friendly to decomposer communities.
Yeah.
So the rate of decomposition is likely to go up in areas like that, where in cold areas, typically it was a slower rate.
Interesting.
We're likely to see a shift as time goes on.
Yeah, which does suggest that perhaps decomposition rates on the planet as a whole have changed over time as climate has shifted.
Yep.
That's interesting
Yeah.
to think about.
I didn't find any specific report, but
did dinosaurs tend to break down faster than mammoths just because it was warmer more parts of the world?
Exactly.
Fascinating.
Decomposer we've talked about is a broad concept, broad term. Very often when we talk about lifestyles, we'll go through what are the features of what sort of physical adaptations do we tend to see. It's not as easy to do that with Decomposer because the way different organisms go about it is so fundamentally different. So Decomposer, once again, is more of a concept of job happening than specific kind of animal or kind of organism. But there are some standout examples and there are some interesting diversity to go through. One bit of that diversity is not all decomposers can decompose all things.
Sure.
If we were to try to decompose things, we can't eat all things because we can't digest all things. You can only decompose what you have the right tools to break down. So the enzymes that can be produced by an organism really limit or decide what things they are going to decompose and decide what things get decomposed more quickly. Common enzymes and the things those enzymes react with are going to break down quicker.
Yep.
So when you have the right reactive chemicals, you can decompose it. Enzymes for digesting things like fat and protein and starch, super common across the animal kingdom.
Yeah. We all have that.
Yes.
Those are extremely common components of organisms' bodies.
Yep.
And within our bodies, we have the ability to break and build those. So the toolkit for breaking those down is very widespread.
Though the genetic code for those kinds of molecules are widespread and widely available, which means those things break down typically first.
Yes, we can break those down.
Exactly.
We can eat that and break it down, no problem.
Things like cellulose in dead plants, the cell walls of plants, less common because the enzyme cellulase is much rarer among organisms. Lignin, which is what makes wood, is even tougher, and only a few groups are known to have enzymes to break that down. So you will see a kind of hierarchy of decomposition hardness scale.
Yes.
There are things that are much more commonly decomposed and things that are less commonly. This is why it's so famous that a dead body will still have its hair.
Because keratin doesn't break down.
Exactly.
Well, and this comes up, this is something that we've mentioned a bajillion times on the podcast. This is also, and we'll get into this later, why certain tissues tend to fossilize more readily.
Precisely. So not all things decompose at the same rate. And this is something that we are familiar with. Not all the things in your fridge go bad at the same rate.
Yes.
Wetter food often goes bad quicker because it's a better environment. Certain types of food, cured meat, doesn't go bad as quickly as raw meat because the curing process makes it tougher to digest. So there are a bunch of things that can go into the commonness of decomposition for different materials and who can decompose it. Probably your most common examples of decomposers are bacteria and fungi. When we think of a food gone bad, it usually is because either bacteria is in it or it's moldy.
Yes.
So those are our go-to examples for decomposers. Both very common, both critical. Fungi often get a bit more attention because they can be more efficient than bacteria. Because bacteria can only invade the surfaces and are much slower to penetrate into, while fungi have their hyphae, their root-like structures,
yes,
and can burrow into a log or body and really get into the material and digest it more or decompose it more quickly.
Yes. Again, episode 200
yes,
for more on that.
Absolutely.
And fungi, again, can break down wood.
Yes.
And that is it is such a rare and important ability to have.
They're so well known that they get white rot type fungus and brown rot type fungus are the two famous wood digesters, and they do it differently. They go about it in different ways. White rot, which is the famous one because it's one of the only organisms known to be able to break down lignin, break down the material that makes wood so tough. And they break it down, then they can get to the cellulose, and when you break down cellulose, you get carbohydrates, which is sugars.
Right.
One quote said that the enzymes they use seem to tear lignin apart by seemingly brute force. We don't actually understand how their enzymes do the job they're doing.
Wow.
We do not actually know how they're breaking wood down. They're doing something that we have not figured out in our labs well.
Like, what is the actual chemical process that, like, where are you targeting it?
What exactly is happening for you to do this? It seems like it's just tearing it apart.
Just smashing it.
Yep.
Oh, man. I'm picturing just a bunch of little fungus enzymes holding phone books, just tearing them apart.
Just pumping each other up. Yeah, bro,
Do it.
Brown rot's a bit more subtle. It goes around the lignin to be able to get to the cellulose, so it actually leaves the lignin behind.
Interesting.
So it can dissolve the cells of the wood, but the structure of the wood is still there. So you end up with these kind of crumbly, spongy logs with brown rot on it.
Yeah.
They're named because of the color that they form. There are also innumerable arthropod examples, insects and their cousins. So many creepy crawlies that are specialized at breaking down organisms and organic material. We can't go through all the fun examples, but like flies are famous examples. Both the adults feeding on bodies with excreting their digestive fluids and sucking it up, but also laying their eggs and maggots working on the corpse. There are tons of decomposition specialized beetles, carrion beetles. My favorite example that I have to mention is syphilid carrion beetles, which bury the body and then roll it up into a ball and then lay their eggs above the body in the chamber, make a little depression and like put regurgitated food and some fecal material for good measure. And then they stridulate to call the babies down, so they click and rub their mouth parts together and whatnot. And then they take care of the babies by continuing to put food in that divot, and then the babies grow off of the body.
Wow, they make just like a little corpse nursery.
Yeah.
Amazing.
And like they will go after like a full rat, and just by digging the earth out from under the body, they will slowly move it down and then bury it.
That's so cool.
Right?
Speaking of obviously dung beetles
Yes.
are doing a similar thing. We've mentioned on the podcast before that a lot of places will use dermestid beetles to skeletonize a spider. If you want to get a skeleton for your scientific collection, you got to get all the other stuff off the bones. And what a lot of our colleagues do is you take your mouse or whatever, you put it in a little thing filled with dermestid beetles, and the beetles will eat everything but the bones.
Yep.
And so you get this wonderful, clean skeleton left behind.
Absolutely.
As long as you take the skeleton out in time.
Yes.
Because once they run out of flesh to eat, they will start eating the bones.
Yeah, if they get hungry enough.
If they start starving, they're going to eat the bone.
There's also tons of wood-eating insects, termites, that are famous for breaking down logs.
Yep.
Even the fungus farming insects that we've talked about in the fungus episodes.
Yep, 202.
Also will be breaking down plant material using a fungus as their tool to break down cellulose.
And termites, that's a good point about termites as well. Termites are able to break down wood because their gut microbes include things like fungi that can break down wood.
Exactly. We could just sit here and like name cool decomposers. This is one of those weird episodes where like we're talking about a topic, but there's so it's like parasites again. We can't actually go into the fun examples because that we would be doing that for forever.
Yes. Go to the Common Ascent website to the topic request form and request an episode for your favorite group of decomposers.
Yes.
And then we'll do that episode someday.
Absolutely. One thing I did want to go over, because I had the most fun learning about this, is there are notable stages to decomposition that a body tends to go through. This is mostly focused on humans, usually.
Yeah, this is a really important part of forensic science.
Exactly.
Like, this is how, when, a body is found, a person has died, and for, whatever the circumstances are, it is someone's job to figure out what happened.
Yes.
How long has this person been here? How long ago did they die? What happened to them beforehand and afterwards? Forensic scientists get very familiar with the activity of insects and bacteria and fungi because that is what is determining what happens to this body.
Yeah, and this is why you hear about those things like body farms where they leave bodies to rot so they can study under different temperatures, in different ecosystems, in different conditions, wearing different amounts of clothes.
Mm-hmm.
How does that affect? So we can have a measurement to predict when we find a body, how long has it been, what's likely to have happened, et cetera, et cetera.
You'll do similar experiments and studies on other species.
Yes.
Often paleontologists are involved in that, understanding how a body breaks down.
Exactly. To forewarn you all, we are about to be talking about the steps of breaking down of a body from a forensics point of view. So it's going to be a bit morbid, a bit gross. We're going to try to be as gross as possible.
Yes. But try to keep it light.
Yes.
But if that's something that you don't want to hear about at all, skip to the mid part of the discussion.
Yes.
And then after that, we'll talk about other stuff.
Yes. Second part will be a lot less gross. When forensics are looking into this, the thing they're trying to determine is time since death, TSD.
Sure.
And the things they use are post-mortem intervals, PMIs. And these typically get broken down into the immediate, early, and late stages.
Okay.
With different steps and sections inside. I also found on Wikipedia another list of the stages of decomposition. So there are different ways to define these stages. One quote I found that I really liked is, all bodies go through the same stages of decomposition, but no two organisms decompose the same way.
Oh, sure.
So they're all going to go through roughly the same pattern, but exactly what breaks down, who breaks them down, how they break down is going to be different.
Yeah, a human is made of different things than a cow.
Yes. But the general steps are still going to happen in roughly the same order because we're both living organisms. The immediate stage is mostly self-caused. It happens immediately after death, and once our metabolism stops and our heart stops beating and we stop breathing, we start to undergo immediate breakdown, and it's caused by things already in our body.
Yep.
So the two factors here are called autolysis and putrefaction. Autolysis is our internal chemicals and enzymes, the things in our cells, in our stomach, and just the chemicals in us now aren't being regulated, and they start to break down the biologic material around them.
Yes.
Just chemical reaction.
This is, because our bodies contain tons of enzymes and proteins whose job it is to break down organic materials.
Yes.
That they're involved in healing and repair, they're involved in digestion. Even like our DNA is constantly being broken apart and put back together as our cells function. And once that's not regulated anymore, now all those enzymes and proteins can just go after whatever's nearby.
Exactly. And the specific thing that causes it, I found really interesting, is when we stop breathing, we stop removing CO2 from our bloodstream in our body. The increase in CO2 increases the pH, the acidity of the body, which causes cells to break open and release all these chemicals and enzymes.
Huh.
So it's the fact that we stop breathing that immediately starts the chain reaction that starts allowing our cells' destructive tools to go AWOL.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So keep breathing, everybody.
Yep, it's important. Putrefaction is the internal microbes that are already in our body. Our gut biome, the residents already present, once we die, are going to keep doing the jobs they've been doing, but no new food and there's no cells to regulate them.
If you're not putting new food into the stomach, those microbes got to eat something.
So that biologic breakdown, the first step is actually from within.
Cool. Gross. Cool.
This is also once again caused by the lack of breathing. Oxygen gets depleted, which sets up an anaerobic and oxygen-poor environment, which allows our anaerobic bacteria and microbes in our gut, whose job it is to digest, to multiply. Now the environment is perfect for them throughout the body.
Yes.
So they can start breaking things down all over the place. Early PMI, which typically runs between 3 to 72 hours after death,
Okay.
is typically estimated and measured by 3 major things: algor mortis, rigor mortis, and liver mortis.
Okay. I've heard of one of those.
Yeah, I didn't know there were 3 mortises. There are 3 of them. Algor mortis is the body beginning to cool.
Okay.
Just
temperature.
Yeah. You're no longer maintaining your homeostasis. So this is going to be true more for warm-blooded animals.
I was going to say, yep.
It still could affect a reptile that had been warming itself.
Absolutely.
But it's more important for things that are keeping their body at a different temperature from the environment. You die, you're no longer maintaining your temperature, so your body's going to now meet the temperature of the environment around you, which in most cases will mean cooling down.
Mm-hmm.
If you're in the middle of a hot desert, then I suppose it could mean heating up. But
sure.
Most of the time, it'll mean cooling down. And a fun rule of thumb that I found is the body decreases 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit or 0.8 degrees Celsius every hour.
Huh.
Yeah.
That's a fascinating statistic.
Yeah. So you could take the temperature of a recently dead body and get a pretty close estimate of how long ago they were alive.
Interesting.
This is why in those shows they're like, body's already cold.
Yes.
That's what this is talking about. Rigor mortis, as is very famous, is the stiffening of the muscles.
Mm-hmm.
When you contract your muscles, you create molecular bonds that are actomyosin filaments. And to break those bonds to uncontract your muscles, you need ATP, which is our power molecule. It's the thing how we move power around the body. You stop creating ATP when you stop breathing, and so you can't uncontract the muscles. Mm-hmm. You can't break those filaments. So the muscles slowly just start to contract. They all start to do it simultaneously, but you will notice it in smaller muscles first. So like face muscles and like digits will happen before leg and arm muscles.
Interesting.
So there is still a procedure.
I've always assumed that this is where the term calling a dead body a stiff.
Yes, exactly.
Like in the old time, that feels very like 1930s. We found the stiff. That I assume that's why they're called that.
Absolutely.
Is that rigor mortis process.
And especially, it lasts a little while. The numbers I found was that it completes typically between 6 to 8 hours after death, maintains for about 12 hours, and then it starts to disappear as those bonds break down anyway through other means.
Yes.
And then liver mortis is the pooling of blood in the body.
Oh, okay.
Your blood's no longer...
The fluids just sort of settle out.
Exactly. You're no longer pumping the blood, so they just start to settle. This completely will depend on the position the body is in, but it will cause the blue, purplish tinge that corpses are known for, because the blood is pulling away from those upper areas.
Gross.
Yeah. So your mortises are the next stage that gets measured, is the body settling out, basically.
Yeah.
Cooling down, stiffening up, and the blood settling. And then late PMI is where things start to get broken down by outside forces.
Right. Bugs and microbes and stuff start getting in there.
Typically there's 5 stages. Fresh stage, which is when we see like fly eggs are present. Not larvae yet, but like fly eggs are there.
Okay. Dear listeners, it helps so much in this section if you just picture like a cow.
Yes.
Instead of picturing a human being for all of this.
This is going to be a somewhat morbid episode.
Again, kind of gross.
Hopefully we said that at the beginning before the news.
that would be a good thing for us to remember to do. We'll make sure to do that. It's going to be like Parasites. We're going to have people who are like, that's the one episode I haven't listened to.
Yep,
like,
and I understand.
Fair.
Early decomposition phase is when we start to see like the skin loosening as connections are broken down. Start to see larvae, maggots start to be present. The body can start to be greenish as bacteria activity is increasing.
Yeah.
This is also when we start to see bloating.
Sure. As the gases are building up.
Bacteria produces gases as their byproduct inside the body cavity, and it starts to inflate the body.
Yeah, I know I've told this story on the podcast before of me helping out a colleague with a taphonomy experiment and having a very tense drive with a very inflated deer on the bed of the pickup truck.
It's those famous videos of whales on the beach.
Yeah.
Where it's like, it can explode.
Yes.
This is also then where we start to see purging, where the bloating, the degradation of the skin can start to cause rips and tears, which can then start to let the fluids, sorry for being gross, but out into the environment.
Ooze.
Yep.
Which also allows further decomposers in.
Exactly.
And helps speed up the process.
You've opened it up. The surface area is there. Bacteria can get into the surfaces inside, so they're not just stuck. Foreign bacteria is not just stuck on the outside of the body. So this is really where it then speeds up. And the next phase is the advanced decomposition phase, and is characterized by the period of greatest mass loss.
Sure.
Where
the fastest decomposition.
Things are breaking down the fastest, materials being removed, most notably here by organisms and by just the loss of like fluids and stuff.
Yes. Well, because as time goes on, all of the tough parts and all of the barriers like the skin and things and the muscles that are tensed up, as those start to break down, that makes it easier and easier for more things to come in and break things down further.
Absolutely.
I'm picturing the talk about the decomposers going inside from the outside makes me think of those videos of hyenas going after like elephant carcasses.
Yes.
And there's the more classic version of like, they break through the stomach and now they're like crawling around in there. But there's also that one video of a hyena with its head just stuck right into an elephant's butt.
Yep.
Going after the softer flesh that it can access.
Yep. I saw it mentioned multiple times that when you find the maggots initially, they're usually around natural openings.
Yes.
Because why start on the middle of the wall? Start at the door.
Once again, cows. Picture a cow. Well, this is also why scavengers will go after certain body parts before others.
Yeah, absolutely.
You'll often see scavenging starts around like the face or the softer, the feet or whatever, rather than like the back, where the skin is thick or there's scales or whatever's on there.
Well, it's like when we eat a chicken or something. The legs and the wings are very easy to get to. The breast meat or the thigh meat takes a little more work, so they're a little less common as the convenient go-to item to get on your plate. One bit of interesting thing, this is just an interesting term that is very fun. All that purged fluid, we talked about how it can affect the environment around the body. There's a term for that. A cadaver decomposition island is formed.
A little microhabitat.
A little microhabitat.
Fascinating.
Isn't that great term?
Gross. Fascinating.
A CDI.
Wow.
And this is caused by like changes in the pH of the soil and like increases in nitrogen that just suddenly the biochemistry of this patch of land has shifted dramatically.
Yeah.
This phase continues until we reach the skeletonization phase where bone is exposed. Typically from there, the body will usually be buried or something. If it doesn't, then the bone will start to wear down, be bleached, be eroded. But then the decomposition slowly peters out and the area slowly returns to a pre-corpse norm.
Yeah.
Another sequence I found that is just fun. It was mentioned in the previous one, but insect invasion is another sequence specifically used very often, both by forensics and just studied, that different insects hit a body and colonize a body at different points, which is very intriguing.
Yes. This is an important thing I've talked with forensic scientists, but also taphonomists.
Yes.
Who have studied this.
And so you can actually, if you get to a body, noting what insects are on it can give you actually a fairly precise idea of how long that body has been there and dead.
Yeah.
The first wave is, unsurprisingly, flies.
Sure.
Blowflies, houseflies. Those are your first ones. Those are the first flies to arrive. There are other flies that come in the second wave. Sarcophagid flies are the next ones to come in the next phase. As these larvae hatch and start to eat the body and live off of it, they are then fed upon by predatory insects that come in, like predatory beetles and their predatory larvae will come in and start feeding on the fly larva on the body. They may also feed on the corpse a bit, but they're mainly there for the other insects.
Yeah, an ecosystem begins to form on the corpse, the carcass. perhaps.
The carcass, yeah.
Carcass.
That is a bit more...
Cow.
The cow.
The cow carcass.
Oh, it'll be cow from here on out. And then some cow farmer's like, no
cows.
No.
I'm sorry, that was just the first animal that I thought. I figure if you've seen a carcass out there somewhere, odds are it was like a cow or a deer or something.
Deer. The third wave are insects that specifically start to come in and break down fats as they start to turn rancid. More flies, phorid flies, hover flies, things like that. Fourth wave consists of cheese skipper flies and other related flies. I don't know what those are.
Sure.
But they come in the fourth. Like the fact that most of the waves are just different kinds of flies that specialize in different aspects of decomposition.
Flies are really good at this.
Yeah. And then the final wave are things like dermestid beetles that come in with the dried body and are eating the tough materials, keratin and stuff like that.
Yes.
That are now too tough or too dried out to be easily eaten by the other insects. This is heavily used in forensic science to the point that measuring the size of maggots on a body can be a important detail in knowing exactly how long this body has been here.
Yeah, which is fascinating.
Yep.
It's morbid and gross.
Oh, yes.
But the fact that there is such a specifically known sequence of events is really interesting.
Yeah.
And I would imagine that, sort of in the broader scheme of decomposition, this is going to be different. A marine organism is going to break down somewhat differently. Obviously, there's not going to be insects going after it. I imagine that a tree, after it falls down, its decomposition process is going to be different. Of course, fruit decomposes and poop decomposes. Depending on what it is, I assume there's going to be a different sequence. But I also assume that there is a sequence.
Yes, and that generally the steps are going to be the same. That the first things that are going to happen is whatever happens right after you die.
Yes.
Your systems have stopped.
All the stuff that, like a tree that falls down, I assume the first decomposers that get to that tree are all of the fungi and insects that were already living in that tree.
Exactly.
That they're just going to keep doing what they were doing already, but the tree isn't fighting them off anymore.
Yep. And that then you're going to be broken down until you are now exposed or colonized to the point that it's just a slow process of disintegrating.
Yes.
The term disintegration is often used in decomposition.
Sure.
Breaking it down into those component parts is just now going to happen. Who's doing it and exactly what's happening, what chemical process is happening will be different. But generally, that sequence of breakdown is going to happen with every organism that dies.
I would be fascinated to know, and I don't know if there's enough research on this kind of thing to actually have an answer to this, if there's like a sequence of different types of fungi on a tree after a tree falls. Could you, in theory, if you had the info, identify the fungus on a fallen tree and determine how long it's been since the tree fell?
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yep.
That would be very cool.
Well, and I didn't remember one part that talked about trees was talking about the fact that initial aggressive breakdown part of breaking it into smaller parts or opening it up a bit is usually started by parasitic organisms that now are just continuing to grow off of the tree that were there or would have fed on it when alive.
Yeah, we're all carrying around our own personal batch of decomposers. Just waiting, just ready to... Well, how people talk about the stereotypical idea of a cat?
Yep.
So, if its owner dies, the cat's going to start eating it. I don't know if that's true, but I do know the cat won't be the first one to get there.
Yep. Yep.
You've got all sorts of pets.
You got a lot of house cats inside you. At this point, we'll take a quick break, and then, after our musical interlude, we'll talk a bit about decomposition in the fossil record and how we study it and how it affects fossils and just decomposition through time and on a wider scale even. So I think the first question that comes up with decomposers in the fossil record is, how do we recognize a decomposer in the fossil record? And like defining a decomposer, there is not like if it has long legs, it's a runner. And if it has strong arms, it's a digger.
Right.
It's not always obvious to be able to look at an animal and go, that's doing decomposition. Especially because the barrier between decomposer, tridivore, and scavenger are blurry and vague. Typically, at least most of the examples I found, when a fossil organism was described as a decomposer, it was either because it was a known decomposer.
Yes. Yeah, it's a fossil blowfly
Yes.
or a fossil dermestid beetle.
Exactly. Fossil fungi and fossil microbes that we know well as decomposers today, and we can recognize it as a similar kind of organism or same group, or that it is associated with a body, that we find a fossilized organism and then associated with that are fungi growing on it.
There's bugs inside of it or whatever.
That's a pretty good sign that you were somehow breaking down this cadaver.
This carcass.
This carcass. This used to be someone. But there are times where it's kind of just a given that, like, in this ecosystem, some of you would have had to be decomposers.
Right.
Because it's an ecosystem. And so for you to be a functioning ecosystem, there had to be decomposers. So it's not always a clear or like, and here's how we know it was a decomposer. It's
right.
We assume some of the members of this assemblage that we have found were decomposing fungi.
Yes. Something was decomposing dinosaurs.
Yes.
We don't know exactly who it was, but the fact that there aren't dinosaur carcasses
a mile high
around on the landscape, something was decomposing dinosaurs.
Exactly. I did find some fun examples of like noted, neat examples of fossil decomposer finds. One was talking about microfossils from the earliest Cambrian that are very similar to fungal-like organisms and cyanobacteria-like organisms. And so not all of them would have been... These, in this specific scenario, would have been part of a microbial mat. So we've talked about this before, that in ocean ecosystems, still today, but famously back before ecosystems became as modern as they are now, or were even in the Cambrian, the ocean floor would have been largely covered by bacterial microbial mats, these layer of ooze.
Right, like a little carpet.
A carpet of living goo that was made up of multiple microbial organisms. There would have been producers in there, usually working off of chemicals, not necessarily photosynthesizing yet, but doing stuff like that. Consumers, microbes eating others, but there would have also had to have been decomposers. The assemblage in this specific study was one found in South China that dated to roughly 535 million years old and had 10 types of filamentous and spherical microbial fossils identified, and most were comparable to some form of fungi, microalgae, or cyanobacteria based off of like the features on the cells. So like at a cellular level, they are similar to those things.
Yeah.
Whether or not they are those groups.
Right. But perhaps behaving like those groups.
You are shaped like these other ones we know. And particularly, they noted that there were mold and yeast-like morphotypes.
Ooh.
So this is an interesting one because it's probably going to be very useful for like understanding the evolution of fungi, which is cool stuff. But also is an insight into the microbial ecosystem of those mats, of those carpets. So once again, not that any of these showed us a sign of it was decomposing, but that we have an ecosystem here of different kinds of microbes, and some of them are shaped like decomposers we know today, and we know that some of them had to be decomposers.
Yes.
So we can still get a glimpse into that role in this ecosystem.
Yeah, and we talked about, especially in episode 201, plenty of examples of fossil sites with fungi fossilized alongside plant remains that in many cases were probably doing at least some of the job of decomposition.
Exactly. So there's lots of examples where we feel very safe to describe the decomposition role that some of these organisms would have been doing because they're the kinds of organisms that do it today.
Yes.
And someone had to be doing it at every point in Earth's history where there were things growing. Another one that I saw, like a specific group that I saw mentioned in a number of fossil papers, were oribatid mites, which are extremely common mites still today. They are itty-bitty, so mites, itty-bitty arthropods. They're kind of tickish in, like if you picture a tick, kind of tickish in their shape, but these are so tiny. and they are just in soil all over the place. There are approximately 7,000 species known today, and they are just everywhere. I saw them described as the most prevalent of all arthropods in forest soils.
Oh, interesting.
They are the most numerate, many-legged things in forest soils, and they're key decomposers. Detritivores or decomposers, they are major in breaking down plant material in the soil and bringing that nutrients into the soil. There's a huge variety, so not all of them are just eating dead material. There are some that feed on living material. You know, anyone who's raised a plant knows that there are mites that can get into your plants and start eating at the roots, but they're also key in eating leaves and dead roots and stuff in the soil. And they are known from the fossil record. Their fossil record begins in the Middle Devonian, but does not reappear until the Jurassic. So
They were on a break.
there's a gap, but we do have evidence of them still in times in between. I found a number of ones. One mentioned mite damage on 7 major Pennsylvanian coal ball deposits and preserved plant tissues with oribatid mite boring traces. No bodies of the mites are known from these sites.
Yeah.
But the trace markers are the same as what we see from them on plants today. So we find stuff like that. I saw one that mentioned that all major plant taxa occurring in Pennsylvanian coal swamps, so coal swamps from this time, are known to have been fed on by these mites.
Fascinating.
Every kind of plant that has been found in these swamps has been found at some point or another with mite damage on it to some degree. And every part of the plants, bark, roots, wood, everything has been shown to have the damage. So they have been prolific decomposers throughout their time on Earth.
Very cool.
And then there was one fun one of a flower that was found from the Cretaceous of Germany with an oribatid mite's mouth in the pollen sac.
It's caught in the act.
Mid-eaten some pollen.
That's awesome. Well, we also talked, probably back in episode 30, about fossilized dung beetle balls, showing that they were doing the same sort of thing. You'll also see discussions of animals like trilobites that are interpreted as bottom-feeding detritivores because they have a similar mouth part shape or body shape to crustaceans and other animals today that crawl around on the seafloor eating detritus and stuff.
Exactly.
So you can get, especially, for animals, for bigger things, some anatomical inferences that you can say, all right, well, this is shaped like this modern animal that is a detritivore probably was doing a similar thing.
Yes, exactly. So there are definitely examples, and there's still, vagueness. Like one of the things I found out about a lot of adult dung beetles that eat on the poop, they're actually eating the bacteria in the poop. The young are more feeding on...
Yeah, because what dung beetles do is that they make a little nest inside the poop ball.
Yeah, and there's ones that burrow under the poop and take some poop down underground, ones that roll up poop to take it away to a nest, and then ones that make a nest inside the poop.
Yeah.
And the young often eat directly on the poop, and the adults will eat it, but a lot of them are often eating stuff.
They're grazing the mold off of the outside
eating stuff
of it.
That's in the poop, not actually digesting the poop itself.
Fascinating. Once again, gross.
Yes.
Fascinating.
Yep. And like to try to bottom feeders could also be one of those of, are you eating the marine snow, which is just dead stuff and poop and stuff, or are you eating microbes in the sand?
Yes. Or are you scavenging?
Yeah. Are you scavenging?
Eating like little dead things.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
And are you doing all three?
Which, absolutely, as we've discussed, the dichotomy between scavenging and predation is a false dichotomy.
Yes.
Almost everything that does one does the other.
If I can eat meat, I can eat meat when it's breathing. It's just more work.
Yeah, it's just it might be harder to catch.
Yes.
So, yeah, decomposers are a portion of the ecosystem that is very interesting from a paleontological perspective because we know for certain that it was happening and that it was widespread, but it is nearly impossible to identify direct evidence of who specifically was doing it.
Yeah.
Whereas, like, plant, producers, yeah, that's easy. Plants. Consumers, that's easy. Things with mouths. Decomposers are a much more nebulous, harder to define and identify group.
Well, it's because like when we talked about all those flies that many of their cousins are not known. Like, so one fly that's known to be very prominent on a corpse, another one of their cousins might not be.
Yes.
And they're shaped like flies still.
Yes. Well, and that, I'm sure I mentioned this before, that same colleague of mine when I was in college who was doing taphonomic studies looking at deer carcass degradation, she was the person who introduced me to the fact that one of the most common insects that she would see around those deer carcasses were butterflies.
Yeah, exactly.
That there are butterflies that feed on the juices, right? The fluids that are building up in the corpse. And as far as I know, they're using the same shape of mouth part that butterflies use to slurp up nectar and stuff.
Like, those butterflies also are going to go to a flower after.
Yes.
They're not necessarily decomposer specialists or cadaver specialists.
Yes. Well, we talked about that in episode 134, the Sanguivores episode, about mosquitoes.
Yes.
It's like, pregnant female mosquitoes will drink blood. All the other mosquitoes are using those same body parts to just drink flower fluids and stuff.
Yes. So there's a lot of instances where you can't just look at them and know that's what they're doing. But if you look like you're basically the same kind of fly as a housefly, then even if this species wasn't, a species like it was probably doing the job.
Right. Well, and it also, this is something that I think is really valuable and interesting to note about decomposers that I didn't say in the beginning, but I thought about it. Being a decomposer isn't just an important part of ecosystem function. It's also kind of just an obvious thing to do.
Yes, absolutely.
If you're a fly and you have the capability to break down, but you go eat dead stuff.
Yes.
And you feed on dead stuff. Fungi that are parasites on plants that can break down the material of a living plant. Well, if you can do that on a dead plant, why not do that? It would be a detriment to your species if you didn't take advantage of a huge percentage of the food you're liable to come across is dead stuff.
Yeah, and the immune system's turned off.
Yeah.
And now it's the easiest it could be.
So there's also something to be said for the fact that if you see an organism in the fossil record that could hypothetically be a decomposer, it probably was.
Yes.
In the same way as a predator, if it was a predator, it was almost certainly also scavenging.
Exactly.
Yeah, if it was a parasitic insect, odds are it could also contribute to decomposition.
Was it a thing that lived in the understory of a forest? Well, then it was probably eating dead leaves and stuff to some degree, unless it was obviously predatory, and then it was probably feeding on those detritivores that were eating dead leaves.
Yes.
But it's always been a job that has to exist and an obvious beneficial one to do.
Yeah, it's an evolutionary no-brainer.
Yes. Another interesting relationship between the fossil record and decomposers is that they affect the fossil record.
They sure do.
This is taphonomy, is studying what happens between an animal dying, and from a paleontology perspective, what happens between it dying and us digging it up.
Yes. Yeah, if decomposers didn't exist, we'd have a much better fossil record.
Oh, yeah. Be so much better. Leave them alone. But there are also examples that I found of the interaction between decomposers and fossil preservation that are kind of unique. Because, obviously, if decomposers have their way, there will be no fossil.
Right.
Because they will eat all of the stuff on it, and then eventually the bones will be broken down by stuff as well. But they will use all the parts, and there will be nothing left. So when things get fossilized, something had to happen to interrupt that process.
Yes. Typically, if something becomes a fossil, it's because some part of it escaped decomposition.
Exactly.
Long enough to be buried and preserved.
That's why one of the key things that you'll see in every description of how does something become a fossil is buried rapidly.
Yes.
We need to get you sealed away.
Safe from all the bacteria and the flies and stuff.
That's why those beetles bury the body, is because it will stay safe and stay better longer under there, where they're the only ones that can get to it.
Yes. And even that doesn't, if you bury something in the soil, it's gonna decompose anyway.
Yeah, partially just because the soil's acidic.
Yeah.
There's acid in the soil that will break it down slowly.
The soil is also where a lot of decomposers live.
Yep.
So, yeah, you do need particular circumstances to... It's why particularly dry and cold environments can be good for preserving things. It's why burial in water and rapid mineralization can be important, because those keep the pieces away from decomposers. It's also why amber is so good at preserving like whole insect bodies, because, yeah, you can't decompose in there because it's trapped in resin.
You sealed it in carbonite.
Yes.
and nothing can get to it. And so when we find examples of really well-preserved stuff, soft tissue preservation and really detailed preservation, a question arises of why? What happened here? And, we often talk about that certain kinds of sediments can do things, certain types of environments. But there also has to be the question of what happened to keep the decomposers away, or what role did decomposition play in this? And I found some interesting examples of that. One was that clay-rich sediments, which is clay is a very fine sediment, are known to often fossilize things really, really well and in really good detail. Part of that's because it's very fine sediment, so it can capture very fine detail. And it has been seen that clay also can inhibit the reactions of enzymes. So the interaction between clay and the body that is being fossilized can actually neutralize enzyme reactions. So that step that we talked about of the body's own chemicals breaking it down can actually be slowed down by the clay.
Yeah, by the actual chemical composition and structure of the sediment.
Yes. And it was found, this study was finding this, that it also seems like it can inhibit bacteria, certain kinds of bacteria that would be decomposers in that situation as well.
Interesting.
Specifically, their studies found that a marine bacterium that is known very commonly in decay for marine organisms and is found in biofilms, so very much like those microbial mats, were inhibited. The growth of those bacteria was slowed down and stopped at times by clay sediment.
Interesting. So yeah, if your carcass is buried in antimicrobial sediment, that's going to get in the way of decomposing.
And so the kind of sediment you're in might not just help seal you away, but actually protect you directly. On the flip side, I found a study about microbial mats being part of the reason for good preservation.
Yeah.
Because microbial mats, when they grow over a body, they can actually seal it away in what they called a sarcophagus. That they can create an entombment of the body as the mat grows over the surface of the organism and can protect it from other decomposers. The microbes will still be doing decomposition, but they won't allow as wide a variety of decomposers in.
Yeah, if they're only decomposing one type of tissue, then all the other tissues might be safe.
And they found some evidence for experiments conducted on fish that the microbes can also cause mineralization as they interact with certain tissues and can cause the body to be mineralized in certain aspects. One study did an experiment on an African dwarf frog. That was a 3-year study, allowing it to be covered by a biofilm, a microbial mat. And they noted that the first thing that happened was rapid entombment. That took 25 to 30 days as the bacteria covered it and created that sarcophagus. But that after that point, it maintained a variety of soft tissues for years.
Ooh.
That it maintained soft tissues for quite a while, and some of them very delicate, that showed greater durability in this situation than they would in others. Things like bone marrow maintained their cell shape, and muscles and connective tissues still had their organic structures present. And then, around day 540, some soft tissues were mineralized. The ones they noted this was in a calcium-rich phase, a calcium carbonate phase that fossilized parts of the brain and some sulfur residues that affected the skin. And so the microbes that are feeding on the body could actually end up protecting it from outside influences.
Yeah. Well, I think I remember reading some paper, and maybe we've even talked about this in the news, that there have been some studies that have shown that certain microbes, their chemical processes, the chemical reactions that they are conducting, can deposit certain minerals or attract certain minerals or end up creating chemical residue that acts as a preservatives for certain tissues, that the biological activity of microbes can actually further the preservation of certain tissues.
Yes.
Or further the fossilization process in certain ways.
Yeah, that like, while this microbe is eating this tissue, this fat cell or this whatever it is that it's eating, the chemicals it's giving off to either dissolve that or the byproducts of that reaction are interacting with the tissues it's not eating.
Yes, or the sediments around the tissues.
And causing reactions that sometimes, not always, but sometimes might actually fast preserve those tissues and make them more durable.
Yeah.
Which can then give us really nice fossils.
Well, and they can also, another, and I don't know, I don't have specific examples of this in my mind, but I have to imagine that a lot of these decomposing microbes are competing with each other.
Yeah, yep.
And, a lot of fungi, for example, produce chemicals that are fungicidal.
Yes, exactly.
That are there to kill any other fungi that might try to get in there. So if your decomposing microbes are also actively warding away competing decomposers, they can actually be helping to preserve the tissues that they're not eating.
Yes, exactly. It's if the body gets taken completely over by one kind of fungi, it will be breaking down that body.
Yes.
But if its defenses mean no one else can get in, it's only going to be able to break down the things it's good at breaking down.
Yes. So it's not as simple as decomposers equals no fossils.
Yeah.
There is a complex relationship there.
And it's so interesting. Which also brings us to the next question of how can we tell when an organism has been decomposed or had decomposition happen to it? Mm-hmm. Which partially the answer is all of them to it a bit.
Right.
Did you not find them with all their organs?
Yes. Yeah, we found just the bones. There was no skin here.
Now,
decomposing happened.
Something had to happen. And so a little bit the answer is always. But we do have times where we can study kind of the process of decomposition on a fossilized organism. Usually that's going to be like traces left and things. I think we talked about this in the osteophagy, the bone-eating episode.
Durophagy, episode 197.
Yes, where there have been dinosaur bones found with boring and feeding marks on the bones.
Yes.
Specifically one site that was a Jurassic site in Colorado that found 2,161 bones modified on 884 specimens that show feeding traces by different organisms on the bones. And this one was cool because they were able to actually get an idea of how many different decomposers there were and what groups there might have been. They found 6 distinct traces, so types of marks on the bone. Pits and furrows, rosettes, whatever that is. 2 types of bioglyph scrapes, which scraping of some kind.
Leaving little messages.
Yeah, right, exactly. Secret codes. Boreholes and chambers.
Ooh.
Based off of the variety of these, they determined that there was a minimum of 4 types of trace makers present in this ecosystem, at least making these traces on the bone, and that the potential members were likely things like dermestid beetles for some of them, and clarid beetles, gastropods, so snails, and then some unknown kind of necrophagous insect, so like flesh-eating insect, and some unknown osteophagous insect, something eating the bone. So something we're not sure of, but based on the patterns, something that was probably eating meat and doing damage to the bone, and something that was eating the bone.
Yeah.
And then once again, kind of like we're talking about the mites, only gastropods are known as body fossils at the site. We don't have fossils of any of the other potential members.
Yes.
But we got snails at the site, and there are marks that seem like they came from the snails, so we know that there was a variety, a robust assemblage of decomposing insects and small organisms, but we only actually have fossils of maybe one of that group.
Yeah.
So it's one of those interesting examples. They were also able to get an idea of the rough timing of probably how it happened, that based on the taphonomy at the site, burial was likely slow, which would probably have ranged from months to 6 years on how long it took a body to be fully buried. And the traces on the bones themselves indicate a minimum residence time of 5 months. That likely it took about 5 months of being exposed for the amount of damage they saw to be put there.
Cool.
So we can get a little bit of the post-mortem interval of some of these dinosaurs.
It's a little bit of that forensics of, these bones were sitting out on the surface for this long for this much decomposing activity to happen.
Yes.
That's very cool.
Which is very neat. Another fun study of the process of decomposition on fossils is whale falls. Mm-hmm. We do have fossil whale falls.
Yep.
So, whale falls, when a whale dies and floats down to the bottom of the ocean floor, most famously in the deep ocean, because whales are often out in the open ocean, but they could die anywhere, so they can happen in shallow water, which can be a little bit different. But typically, we see those stages that you talked about. We see scavengers come in, the mobile scavenger stage.
Fish, sharks, things like that.
The enrichment opportunist stage follows that, which are things like crustaceans coming in to feed off of it, polychaete worms, other small organisms feeding on the bits left behind. And then very often there is a sulfophilic stage, which is as compounds are broken down, specifically things like bone lipids, sulfide and methane get released from that process, and this supports communities of chemosynthetic organisms, so things that feed off of those chemicals and then do basically photosynthesis, but without sunlight, they use these chemicals. These are going to very famously include things like certain bivalves and bacteria, specifically vesicomyid and bathymodiolid bivalves. You'll also see some members that are from things like hydrothermal vents and cold seeps that are also chemosynthetic and will use the whale's body for a bit to do that.
As a stand-in hydrothermal vent.
Yep. And then finally, there is a reef stage that has been hypothesized, but I don't know that it's been documented based off of what I read, of things, filter feeders and stuff, settling on the bones and using it like a rock surface
like
to
a
grow
reef
on.
would do.
Mm-hmm. This doesn't always have to happen in this exact order. It can happen, the stages can overlap and be slightly out of order even as different parts of the body go through different processes. In shallow water, it was thought that it didn't have that sulfophilic phase, but some experiments have shown that they could actually still do it. The main difference is that the organisms that are found on shallow water whale falls are just not as endemic and not as specialized.
Right.
Because there's more life in the shallow water, so more things can get to the body. Deep sea are usually deep sea specialists. In the fossil record, the oldest examples are in the Eocene, and these differed in our understanding because A, the whales were smaller. Mm-hmm. They hadn't gotten to the giant filter-feeding whales that we have today and in recent history. So even the largest members were smaller than the smallest adult members today. And from all of our findings up until recently, they lacked those vesicomyid bivalves.
Okay.
Which suggested that they didn't have that sulfophilic stage. And the idea was that they weren't big enough to have that stage.
Okay.
The body wasn't big enough.
They just got broken down too quickly, or it wasn't producing enough of those chemicals.
Exactly. There wasn't maybe enough material to have that chemical stage.
Okay.
But since then, other fossil sites have been found, some in the Oligocene, that are also smaller bodied whales and still have no presence of those vesicomyid bivalves, but do show other chemosynthetic organisms.
All right.
So suggest that they might have still gone through a chemosynthetic phase. And then one in the Miocene that was found did have those bivalves and is still a small whale, which now led to maybe the idea that it wasn't the size, but maybe the fatty aspect, those lipids in the bones, that was a feature that was needed. So it's not necessarily the size of the whale, but how the whale is built.
Yeah.
Which is all made all the more interesting when we talk about the fact that there's also been found an ichthyosaur fall.
Yes.
In a late Jurassic specimen that was an ichthyosaur, which are those marine reptiles that were very dolphin-esque in their shape.
Yes, some of which were very large.
Yep. One was found that seems to show signs of a whale fall type community growing on the remains of this ichthyosaur.
Mm-hmm.
There were signs of that mobile scavenger phase of things feeding on the body. There were signs of
tooth marks and scrape marks and stuff like that.
There were signs of that enrichment opportunist phase of smaller organisms coming in and nibbling at the leftovers. But it doesn't seem like it was followed by that sulfophilic stage.
Mm-hmm.
And this could have been that there's something different about ichthyosaurs and the way their bones were or their anatomy was that caused them not to have that phase, or that what seemed to happen next was they were covered by microbial mats. That the players that came in were a bit different, and that then there is evidence of a well-developed reef stage.
Yeah, I remember this study, and I remember it being framed as, in modern whale falls, we tend not to see the skeleton become the foundation for a reef, but we do see that seems to happen with, there's stuff growing and living on top of these bones.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember at the time the hypothesis being, is it that today the bones don't last as long?
Yep.
Because there are decomposers that are breaking apart the bones.
Yes.
But back then, if those decomposers, they weren't around or they weren't doing that, the bones survived longer and there could be a reef on top of it.
Yep.
But also, as you just said, the idea that if it's just that decomposers are acting on it differently, that's going to affect the stages in the future of those bones.
Exactly. So there could be multiple reasons for why it went differently. The fact that Osedax, the bone-eating worms,
yes,
likely, at least based on the evidence, and the fact that there isn't evidence on this one, hadn't evolved yet, might mean that there were not bone-breaking down specialists like there are for modern whale falls. But also, there was a different pattern to an ichthyosaur fall than whale falls as we know them. And this also is notable that this was a shallow water ichthyosaur fall.
Yeah, I assume you're not going to get much of a reef in the deep ocean because there's just not that many reef builders that live down there.
And there might have been a different process. Like, the bone-eating worms are famous in deep sea whale falls, less famous in shallow water whale falls.
That's true.
So there might have been something doing a different job down in the deep ocean. So we can get kind of an idea of the process in some situations and learn some really interesting patterns.
Yeah, well, and this is another one of this will come up every now and then on the podcast when we talk about some aspect of ecosystems or organisms that is a few steps removed from what we actually get in the fossil record, so it becomes really purely speculative.
Yep.
But the thought of how did decomposition dynamics differ at different times in the past? Like, was a decomposing triceratops different from a decomposing rhino or elephant of the same size? Did the tissues of the body affect the decomposition? Did what insects were around? Well, like a stegosaur would have been around before most modern groups of insects were around.
Yeah.
So was it decomposing? You wouldn't have gotten those fly stages because those flies weren't around.
Yep.
The climate was different. Would that have had an impact? You didn't have the same plants, and so I assume your soils were different. There's all sorts of these fascinating questions. If we went back and watched a decomposing Stegosaurus, what would we have noticed that is the same as today? Would we, right? There would be like a little theropod with its head in the butt of the stegosaur, and we'd go, yeah, that's how it works. But then also it's like, oh, these tissues just stick around for a long time for some reason.
It takes forever for those to break down because their blood has a chemical nature to it.
Right.
That evidently is antimicrobial to such a degree, it stays so after death.
Or this stage of the decomposition process lasts a lot longer because there isn't as much to break through the skin, and so you don't get to the... It's the possibilities are endless, and it is fascinating. It's like imagining life on other planets.
Yes.
Like, who knows what the parameters are? It's fascinating to think of all the ways that the fundamental process of decomposition might have been different at different periods in Earth's past.
Absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting versions of that question is, did fungi end the Carboniferous? Did they cause the end of the coal deposits that are so famous from the Carboniferous.
Episode 95, we talked about the Carboniferous rainforest collapse.
Yes.
So the breakdown of the famous forest ecosystems of the Carboniferous period.
Absolutely. The Carboniferous, named thusly because of massive coal carbon deposits famous from that time that were formed during that time. This is also noted by like huge amounts of CO2 being pulled out of the atmosphere and deposited in the ground.
Yep.
This likely contributed to glaciation and lowering of temperatures. So like major time period, the most intense coal forming period in Earth's history.
Yes, coal formed by the dying vegetation in swamps and forests and places like that. Lots of plants means lots of dying plants, which means lots of coal.
Exactly. That's how you get coal, is if you bury a tree for long enough and under enough pressure and it doesn't rot, it will get compressed into just the carbon basically left, and that's what coal is. How this happened, there's been a couple of hypotheses as to why so much coal got preserved, why these trees weren't getting broken down in a way that would have caused them just to rot, and instead they were sticking around as coal deposits. One classic hypothesis is that the peat swamps that were famous during that time are great preservation environments. Mm-hmm. Something in a peat swamp is sealed off from the outside environment really well. This is why you can get bog mummies and stuff like that.
Yep.
It is a really good preservation environment. And the idea was that, yeah, these trees were falling in peat swamps and not breaking down, not decomposing, so they were able to stick around and preserve. But another hypothesis, and potentially in line with that, is the idea that fungi, white rot type fungi, had not yet evolved the ability to break down lignin, which makes wood. So these trees were falling and there was not a tree decomposing specialist yet.
Yeah.
So what was I saw called a lag between the development of wood and the development of wood decomposers.
Yes. Yeah, in episode 73, we talked about trees. Mm-hmm. And the Carboniferous is famously the reason there were all these giant forests and swamps and stuff is because trees were a new thing.
Yes.
And they took over the world because there wasn't a lot around to stop them. And as time has gone on, ecosystems have adjusted to be more in balance with the trees, and trees are less overwhelmingly influential.
Yeah, a dead tree does not just stick around anymore because there are things that break it down somewhat quickly.
Yes. So the idea that that was true not only for things like parasites of trees or herbivores of trees, but decomposers of trees is very interesting.
Especially because lignin decomposition is mostly only known from white rot fungi.
Yeah, this was really an incredible thing that plants did at this time, is they went, we have developed a compound that no one can break.
Yes, indestructible.
We have made an indestructible compound that we can we can grow hundreds of feet tall because we have developed this incredible new material. And eventually fungi went, nah, we figured it out.
Yep. And they're one of the only, I saw it noted that white rot's the only one truly known to be able to break down lignin. Mm-hmm. There might be other examples, but they are really the only widely known and successful group that can break it down. So this lag between those two might have allowed for an accumulation of wood, and then based off of molecular analysis and studies on the fungi ancestry, it seems likely that the ability to break down lignin probably evolved around 290 million years ago, and the Carboniferous ended around 300 million years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So it has been a very popular idea that, yeah, once fungi broke the lignin code, we stopped getting the Carboniferous because now the trees were getting broken down.
A decomposition revolution.
Yes. But there are some people who disagree, and there is evidence that does not line up with this perfectly.
Okay.
One being the first white rot type fungus fossils known are not until 260 million years ago.
Okay.
So there is a decent gap between when it's estimated they might have gotten the ability and when we see fungi that likely had the ability. And there are some that argue just some logical fallacies that they see with the hypothesis. One being that it's likely that there had to be decomposers for the trees to some degree. Not every tree could be just laying around.
Right.
That's impossible. That would have ruined the carbon cycle on the planet.
Absolutely. Yeah. They must have been decomposing somewhat.
So someone had to be breaking them down somehow. And as far as our evidence shows, the brown rot fungus that gets around lignin was a later development for fungi. So they argue that even if white rot didn't show up until then, probably someone had the ability to break lignin down. There are other enzyme and chemical mechanisms that are known to have lignin modifying abilities. So it's very likely that some other bacteria or fungi could have had that. Mm-hmm. So just from that logical standpoint, there's a bit of incredulity about the idea that it was not happening at all for the entire Carboniferous. They also note that in many of the coal deposits and of the Carboniferous, many of the forests were populated by unlignified trees and tree-like plants. That many of them weren't using lignin and were still forming coal.
Yeah.
So the lignin doesn't have to be the keystone to why we got coal.
Yeah.
We can get coal from other non-lignified trees, and that throughout the Carboniferous, there are many transitions with lignin-poor species and lignin-rich species, and coal production doesn't seem to rise and fall with either group being the more dominant.
So it's not as simple as white rot showed up and the plants stopped forming coal.
Yes.
Although it is a really interesting question to wonder, was there some sort of decomposition difference that allowed for the formation of those coal beds?
Absolutely. They also note the fact that coal deposits did not stop after the Carboniferous. When the opportunity is right, coal production has continued fairly consistently on Earth since then.
Right.
So having white rot has not stopped the deposits. So it is a question that I find really interesting as how much did this decomposition ability affect or cause or end the Carboniferous?
Well, and I think as an extension of that, it's really interesting to think about, we've talked a bunch on the podcast before about the formation of land ecosystems as we know them. That the first animals that went up onto land, and then they created ecosystems of them eating each other, and then what stages did plants take as they became... And in episode 173, we talked about how herbivores, as we think of them today, took a while to really become a thing on land. It's equally fascinating to think about how did the decomposer portion of land ecosystems develop and form over, the late Paleozoic as land ecosystems first showed up.
Absolutely.
Very cool.
It's very neat. And that's where we're going to wrap up our discussion. There's a million other cool examples to go through. This is a broad topic.
There are some episodes where there's like an obvious other topic that we could like branch off into or follow it up. And I picture them sometimes as like a little branch that comes off of this particular episode. This episode is like a shrub.
Yeah, absolutely.
There's just branches. There's this overlaps with tons of other fascinating topics.
Like we mentioned a whole bunch of groups that we hadn't mentioned a bunch in other episodes, like dung beetles and dermestid beetles and cool organisms that came up.
Yeah, we talked about mites.
Yeah, mites. And so like
fungi, which we did. We did fungi. We never have talked about fungi.
You go listen to that one. I didn't talk about
all three of them.
I talked about them exactly as much as I should have because we talked about them plenty.
You did. I really appreciate it.
So if there's other decomposer and decomposition topics that you would like to hear about, send us your requests. We'd be happy to hear them.
Certainly.
Before we wrap up the episode, our last segment is our patron question. Every episode, we like to answer one of the questions submitted by one of our patrons, which you can do if you sign up on our Patreon at a certain level. David, what's our question for this episode?
Today's question comes from Ava, who asks, what is your favorite scientific expression, name, or phenomenon, and what does it mean? Mine, Ava says, is marching molars.
Yay!
Marching molars describes the way that, for example, elephant teeth grow in is that they push in from the back.
Yes.
Like a conveyor belt of teeth.
And they wear down and then are either reabsorbed or fall out the front. This is a fun question. And I picked it, one, because I like these fun phrases, but also because there's one phrase that I really love that fits in this episode perfectly.
Excellent.
Bloat and float.
Yeah, that's a good one. Bloat and float's great.
I was nervous you were going to bring it up the whole episode, and I'm like, no.
You're right. That's true. I did, and I forgot.
There is a phenomena. I learned this at the Gray Fossil Site, which was a watering hole. Mm-hmm. There's a phenomenon that happens when organisms die and rot. We talked about the bloat phase, where they can fill with the gases created by the bacteria inside the body. If that body is then either able to shift onto water or was already in the water, and if they don't burst, they're now just a big balloon.
Yeah.
And balloons float. And you can get a decomposing body floating on the surface, very prominently on the surface. The bloat and float concept is that some of the bones found at the fossil site are scattered randomly.
Yeah, sometimes you'll find the whole skeleton is just right here because it got buried at the same time.
Yep.
But sometimes at a fossil site that's like a pond or something, you'll find just a single bone over here, a single bone over there. Yep. And the idea is that in some cases it might be that a carcass was floating on the surface, dropping bones around.
The digits and stuff were rotting out of the skin and falling down while the body was still floating. And it just did a little tour around the pond.
Yeah.
Dropping really gross confetti.
Gross.
Float and float.
It's great. That's a great one for here.
My actual personal favorite is Trophic Cascade.
Trophic Cascade's pretty good.
It's so good. This is the concept of the whole food web thing of if you remove the wolves, then the deer population explodes, which reduces the underbrush, which changes the forest, which then changes who lives in the forest. A trophic cascade.
Yes, through the web of life in that ecosystem. Just ripples.
Yes, cascading effects. It's a very epic sounding term, and it describes a cool concept.
Yeah.
So thank you, Ava. That's fun terms. And thank you, everyone, for listening to the episode. If you would like more information, check out the blog post. Links in the description for more links, sources, and pictures. We'll try to keep the pictures.
Yeah, the pictures we'll be careful with. That's going to be a fun challenge.
This is the first 18 or older.
Yeah, this is rated M.
Don't forget, we're going to be at ETS UConn coming up soon.
March 30th.
Also going to have our museum meetup.
March 29th, the day before.
Very excited for those. Silver String Science is also on the horizon.
Yes.
So get ready for that. Thanks to everyone who requested this episode. Thank you to all of our new patrons. And tippy-top extra thanks to our top-tier patrons, Sarah May, Jeff Ellington, and Danielle the Bug Lover.
Thank you all so much.
And with that, we've reached the end of our decomposition stages.
It's just skeleton now.
Just skeletonization. This was also called the dry stage in the Wikipedia one,
that makes
which
sense.
I liked. Yeah.
Yeah. Gross.
Now I'm just going to erode.
Erode. We release episodes every fortnight, which is long enough to go through multiple of the stages.
Oh, yeah. You'd
That's
have
a
a
whole
number
lot.
of different flies on you.
So check on us 2 weeks from now. See what stage we're at. This is a gross episode.
I love it. Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent Podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.